Hello, everybody. This is Constance from Mysterious Galaxy. I want to give a big thank you for joining us tonight. I am very excited for all of our sci-fi lovers out there. We have Charles E. Gannon, and he's going to be in conversation with Jim Freund. I'm going to go ahead and let Jim take it away, and have a good event, you guys.
Yeah.
Constance.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself in about 10 seconds. I'm Jim Freund. I am a radio talk show host about science fiction in New York since, God help me, 1971. And I'm also the curator of the New York Review of Science Fiction Readings. And this will be about my second or third interview, at least, with Charles E. Gannon, which is the reason why we're here. Fourth?
Fourth.
Cool. So let me introduce him from proper copy. Dr. Charles E. Gannon's Caine Riordan hard science fiction novels have all been national bestsellers. 4, including the latest, Marque, that's Q-U-E on the end, of Caine, have been Nebula finalists. 2 have been Dragon Award finalists, and the first is also a Compton Crook winner. An overlapping series, Murphy's Lawless, launched this year. His epic fantasy series, The Vortex of Worlds, debuts in 2021. He collaborates with Eric Flint in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal best-selling Ring of Fire series. The first of his 2 solo novels in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising series, At the End of the World, released in July. I think it's tomorrow. Is that right, Chuck?
Correct.
Okay. He has written in the Starfile, Honorverse, Magazine, and War World universes. Other credits include in short fiction, game design, and writing, scriptwriter, and producer. He is a distinguished professor of English. Gannon received 5 Fulbrights. His book, Rumors of War and Infernal Machines, won the 26th ALA Choice Award for Outstanding Book. He is a frequent subject matter expert in national media venues, including NPR, Discovery, etc., and for various intelligence and defense agencies. So, good evening, Chuck.
Good evening, Jim. Good to see you again.
Likewise. So this is actually, I think, the first time we're doing something that constitutes being live, and it's really exciting to be doing it as a celebration of a book and yet another Nebula nominee recently, and the forthcoming series just coming out in the just recently released new series.
Yep.
So, but I think that we're going to be starting with you reading from the, what you told me David Weber refers to as the Caine verse.
According to David, that is something that more and more readers have picked up. And, you know, my attitude was really, but on the other hand, you know, never look askance at branding.
Exactly.
So since the name of the character, the lead character, is right there, I'm not going to argue with it. And before I start reading, I wanted to say thanks to everybody. Your questions will drive most of this, just like they have in the other live streams. Thank you for coming here again. All new readings. I'm going to start with something from Marque of Caine, and I'm going to roll right over to something else from the Caine verse, but not from Marque of Caine, although it may sound a lot like it. And then we'll get into some questions. And I've got a short reading from the Black Tide Rising book, At the End of the World, if we have those extra literally 3 minutes to do it. So you'll be the drivers on all of that, along with Jim Freund, who's running the bus right now. So at any rate, this is from Marque of Caine. Arriving, and I'll do a scene set for you very, very quickly. Marque of Caine is, as somebody has put it, Marco Polo, the journeys of Marco Polo sort of had a love child with fall of the Roman Empire in space with aliens. And there's more than a little bit of justice in that particular strange summary. This is the point in which he has begun to move through the the last of the alien species, the only one that has not been, that no one has seen the inside of their civilization, the Dornaani. They're the very old ones. They're the ones who sort of know what was going on in this neck of the woods 20,000 years before, about which there's quite a few still standing mysteries. And this is a visit to a planet where Caine gets a chance to see how they used to reproduce and part of their culture from earlier times. Arriving just before dawn, they discovered the surface of the breeding pool already stippled by small ferocious eruptions. The accompanying pattern of irregular splashes and flops reminded Riordan of schools of small fish snatching insects from the surface of a lake. Flunrult must have noticed the sideways tilt of Caine's head as he concentrated on the sounds. It is the Geel. They are catching the spawn. How many survive? Perhaps 1 in 10. Riordan glanced in the direction of the old Dornaani's receding voice. He was leading them into an overgrown thicket of what looked like immense broccolini. How is 1 in 10 enough to maintain your population? How is it enough for your terrestrial fishes and frogs? Like them, we are evolved to it. He pointed across the breeding pool where there was a growing motion in the brush lining those banks. The bearers are leaving the water. Their part in reproduction is now over after having been quickened 6 months ago. Despite Flunrult's casual tone, Riordan kept his own carefully respectful. By quickened, I presume you're referring to fertilization. Mating? Flunrult's answering burble was exasperated. Fertilization does not require mating. Reproduction begins when the quickeners, whom you misleadingly deem males, release a scent indicating that they are nearing what you call estrus in females of various terrestrial species. This attracts bearers who are not already gravid. They signify their reciprocal interest by releasing a scent of their own. This stimulates the quickener to deposit a substance analogous to the milk released by your planet's salmon. The bearers absorb the milk, which stimulates the ovaries to release 4 to 6 eggs for fertilization. The Dornaani seemed far more alien than they had only a minute before. Riordan looked out over the pond. There was no longer any motion or noise along the opposite bank. However, the surface of the water, now dull orange with the first glimmers of dawn, was alive with the constant, fitful feeding of the Geel. Riordan suppressed an impulse to rush out into the water in an attempt to disrupt or chase off the Geel. It was a pointless reflex here, one that had been evolved for, as Flunrult put it, a different reproductory paradigm. But as unnecessary and inappropriate as it might be, it kept surging up whenever Caine was not consciously combating it. At least conversation and questions were a distraction. So, how many eggs would you guess still remain now? Almost all. They're hard-shelled. Few predators can breach them. Once they hatch, though, the spawn are completely vulnerable. To survive, they must swim across the pond to our side, where the quickeners await in the grottos. Do they fight off the Geel? There's no need. The Geel avoid the smell of mature Dornaani. Well, that's convenient. No, it is a matter of evolutionary balance. Flunrult's mouth, visible now, twisted slightly. There is ironic reciprocity between the Geel and my species. When we are but spawn, they eat us. But when we are mature, we eat them. The once placid surface of the pool was now thoroughly hazed and flecked by their frenzied feeding. Riordan swallowed. That's a pretty dangerous way to enter the world. Flunrult dangled a pair of non-committal fingers. Here on this side of the pool, among the first calling grottos, it is more dangerous for the quickeners who await them. Why? The old Dornaani gestured into the thick vegetation at their backs. The predators you heard earlier. He raised his head, neck corded by long, wrinkled folds. They lurked nearby. Riordan shifted until his right flank faced the pool and his left the tangled cluster of goldenrod trees and day-glow green tubules that screened them from the forest. In the early days, those predators must have taken a terrible toll on your quickeners. They still do. Despite the warm air, Riordan felt a sudden chill. He examined his surroundings more closely. The breeding pool's long use had smoothed or displaced any hand-sized rocks that might have once been there, and no weapon-worthy deadfall presented itself. No one guards the quickeners while they're in the grottos? It could be arranged, of course, Flunrult answered, but it is not traditional. Many believe that lessening of any of the risks to the spawn, bears, or the quickeners changes the secretions release. They assert that making the process safer also makes the surviving spawn, and so us, less resilient and more vigorous than in ancient times. So part of the reason they come here is to play some primal game of Russian roulette? Riordan glanced into the brush, no sign of movement, but it was so thick that he probably wouldn't have detected a creature hiding within leaping distance. Any idea how close those predators are? I cannot say. They're patient, silent. But you still hear them? No, I smell their musk. Close enough to smell them? Great. They will not attack unless the first of the spawn begin approaching the grottos and distract the quicken. And what about us? We're not in the water making the sounds that attract the predators. They will not be interested in us. Of course, if one of the coyote is particularly ravenous, it may take a second opportunistic kill before starting to gorge. We would be a convenient second meal. So the longer I sit here waiting like a respectful guest, the greater the chance that one of these coyote is going to grab me before I find a weapon. Keeping a woefully inadequate rock cocked back in his right hand, Riordan parted the foliage with his left, gritting his teeth against the primal terror of pushing through a blind wall of dark, unfamiliar brush. A few meters on, enough light filtered through the goldenrod trees and tube bushes to illuminate the forest floor in rough patches. He found a promising arm's-length piece of deadfall, but it crumbled in his grasp, rotted through by the pervasive moisture. Shouldering his way deeper, he noticed a more sizable rock underfoot, wrestled an obstructing fern aside with both his strength and body weight, but discovered that it was a completely useless shape. He peered into the thickening brush, wondered if behind him there was a splash, and then a keening wail which cut off as abruptly as it started. Damn it! Riordan, already smashing back along the gap he had left in the brush, had never heard a Dornaani cry out in desperation, was chilled by the similarity to a human child. He burst through the last tangle of bushes in a spray of leaves and tubules, squinting into a sudden flare of daylight. He saw a shape rising out of a crouch at the edge of the water, hauled back the rock in his right hand as he prepared to block with and probably lose his left forearm. But the shape was Slunrold's. Riordan's pulse was still loud in his ears. You're okay? Slunrold stared at him. If I was not, I would no longer be here. He shifted his stare to the rock in Riordan's hand. His mouth twisted slightly. Riordan tossed it away. What happened? I heard a predator struck 3 grottos over. I suspect we have lost Glinheen. May his final enlightenment be full. The old Dornaani looked after the discarded rock, then back at Riordan. You are impetuous, but then again, you are human. I see why Almdul has come fond of you. He turned back to the water, watching and listening. Listening for another of his own kind to be grabbed, like a wide-eyed frog plucked off a lily pad. Christ, how can he just sit there? Caine took a deep breath, reminded himself that this wasn't his planet, wasn't his species, and most of all, wasn't his fight. Because fighting was not what the Dornaani did in this situation. But that silent recitation of the facts didn't still the urgent heartbeat straining against the back of his sternum, straining for release, for action. Slunrold had turned back, was staring at him. You are distraught? Caine realized that his breathing had become faster, deeper, that he was leaning forward toward the angular shapes of the huts and shacks that he had seen yesterday. He nodded toward them slowly. Those buildings, are there any tools in them? Yes, but not many. Slunrold's eyes edged down a bit, and none that you would find useful. What do you mean? I am familiar with your species, Caine Riordan. You wish to fashion weapons. I do. Can you blame me? I do not blame you. I merely reiterate. Those of my race who come to this place wish it to be as it was. This means eschewing any tools and any actions which separate them from that experience. Riordan nodded. I will honor those constraints. The only constraint upon you is that you may not enter the breeding pool. Other than that, you may come and go as you please. There are no limits on your freedom of action. Riordan's field of focus tightened until he was only aware of the old Dornaani's face. He carefully repeated the phrase, there are no limits on my freedom of action. That is what I said, human. You are free to do what you will. Slunrold turned away. Riordan looked back toward the huts, started to rise, then sat again, slowly. No. He could leap up, fashion weapons, go hunting the coyote who, unopposed, might kill many quickeners this day. But in so doing, he would also destroy the experience for which these Dornaani had traveled dozens of light years, to breed as their first ancestors had, to ensure that their spawn would possess a greater measure of the vitality that was slipping swiftly from their race, to live a real experience, not some virtual imitation of one. Caine realized he was still sitting very erect, tense, poised for combat. He forced himself to exhale, to sink back into a sitting position and acknowledge that here, his instincts could only mislead him. He had been invited to observe, not intervene. If Flunrult heard his restlessness or noticed the stillness that followed, he gave no sign of it, leaving Riordan in silence as reason and reflex continued to struggle within him. That's reading one.
Okay, cool.
There is I said there would be a quick one immediately thereafter. This is from a Caine novella. It is going to be coming out very early next year, probably January. It spins off from these experiences, and actually what you're going to hear is a different reaction to the scene, the end of that scene that you just heard, because Caine's experiences in Virtua are about to take a most unusual turn, and this is a scene from that. So we're picking up right at the last lines of that last scene. Riordan's field of focus tightened until he was only aware of the old Dornaani's face. He carefully repeated the phrase, "There are no limits on my freedom of action." "That is what I said, human. You are free to do what you will." Flunrult turned away. Riordan barely heard the last comment. He was already sprinting toward the huts. He passed a small group of staring Dornaani, many of whom were completely naked. Smooth and externally sexless, he had a fleeting impression of large-eyed fairy folk. Even before he got to the huts themselves, Riordan saw that they were made of what looked like gnarled, close-set bamboo, each shaft set into the ground. There'd be no pulling one up, not quickly enough to be helpful. Their roofs were a mixture of thatch and large spatulate leaves, no help there either. He blinked, forced himself to stop seeing the details to look at the whole building instead. Its exterior walls were propped up by longer, straighter shafts of the same fibrous material, driven into the ground at a fairly acute angle. He studied the closest. It had been hammered into the hard-packed dirt, and just where it entered the ground, it tapered into a fire-hardened point. Within a minute, Riordan had dislodged 3 of the supports and was already sprinting back towards the woods. Even before he was fully in the brush, Caine heard another brief, terrified cry further along the shore where the quickeners waited in the first calling grottos. Keeping on the trail, one sharpened pole cocked back in his right hand, the rest in his left, he accepted the loss in speed for the increase in both reaction time and stealth. He saw tracks that emerged from the landward side of the main trail, which had crushed through the brush toward the quickener's shore. How something so large had made effectively no noise was beyond Riordan's very rudimentary tracking skill, but it gave him a vastly increased respect for this unseen foe. Judging from the gap it had made in the underbrush, the creature was approximately half the height, but almost twice as wide as a human. The first 5 meters of tracks led Caine to believe he was following a biped with broad, 2-toed feet and a heavy back spur. However, as the tracks approached the water, the distance between them increased. This creature had broken into a run, and its pattern was now that of a cat or a dog at speed, widely separated, paired impacts. So, quadruped? Not exactly, Caine realized when, just before entering the grotto, he saw a sharp imprint in the loam. This was a very different 3-digit extremity, one that resembled a paw or even crude hand, with respectable talons. So evidently, like the great apes, these creatures were capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion, defaulting to the latter when they needed a burst of speed. Riordan held his makeshift spear a little higher and edged out of the brush. There were no living creatures on the shore of the grotto, but definitive signs of one having been savaged. A Dornaani's maroon blood and orange lymphatic fluids were spattered liberally around the vegetation and on the bank, but less so along the final vector of the creature's attack, straight from the trail, and then a long leap to land upon its target in the water. Riordan glanced around, discovered the point where the blood and fluid trail disappeared into the undergrowth. A quick inspection of where the creature came up out of the water indicated that it had done so on all 4s, and continued to do so as it carried off its prey, which suggested 2 things. Firstly, that this Kayat wasn't big enough to tuck a dead or dying Dornaani under one arm. Secondly, since it was able to carry off that Dornaani in its mouth, it possessed strong, heavy jaws and a neck to match. Riordan considered his spear's fire-hardened tip, the 2-inch diameter of its shaft, not enough for a straight-up fight, which meant coming up with more inventive tactics, which meant more delay. Sadly, time might not be a critical factor either. Judging from the blood loss and the elapsed time since the Dornaani had screamed, it was doubtful that the quickener was still alive. So better to go slow, get a look at this thing, see if I can figure out any way to get an advantage over it, because damn it, Caine surveyed the shallow trough the creature had left as it hopped up the bank with its prey. This thing weighs at least 200 kilos, not counting its kill. and I'm pretty sure my non-existent spear skills aren't up to that task. Riordan didn't have much time to formulate an advantageous plan of attack. Less than 100 meters away from the breeding pool, he heard the same kind of falsetto grizzly roars that had startled him during his pre-dawn walk with Flunrul. After a moment of silence, low growling arose again and intensified. It rapidly crescendoed and was succeeded by heavy, brush-shaking impacts and more high-pitched yowls of fury. Again, sudden silence. And again, an exchange of dull, throaty grunts that was the harbinger of yet another impending outburst. That, Riordan realized, was probably the best time to approach undetected and get a better look, not only at the species, but how they fought and moved. He parted the fronds. What Caine hadn't been prepared for was how hideous the creatures were. Locked in an arm-to-arm grapple that recalled a Greco-Roman wrestling match, each was trying to bend the other towards its own pocket-like mouth, which was pretty much their whole head. Rather than upper and lower jaws, it was comprised of 4 roughly triangular flaps, which, when opened, probably looked akin to a head-on dreidel. But open, each flap was a bone-spine triangle with 4 rows of teeth that were reaching, straining towards each other's necks and arms, whichever was closer. As they broke apart with another exchange of shrill yowls, Riordan saw the layout of the creature more clearly. Gray-skinned and covered in scales, it had implausibly large shoulders and upper arms, as well as thighs. In addition to a tail more like a lizard than a croc's, it had 4 smaller whip-like appendages that helped it maintain balance and occasionally tug at an opponent's exposed leg. The most unusual feature was a delta-shaped flap-scarred, semi-rigid hide on its back, the broad part attached up near its shoulders, almost like a cape. Apparently a protective growth had also limited the creature's flexibility. Its most upright posture was only a pronounced stoop. But try as he might, Riordan couldn't spot the creature's eyes until they spotted him. There were 4 of them, each one located on the skull, just between the 4 junctures of the 4 mouth flaps, which had all turned toward him. To see how that works out, you'll just have to get the novella.
And the name of the novella?
The name of the novella is still in process. I don't have that one yet, but folks who are following the Murphy's Lawless series, Chris Kennedy's publications, and the Beyond Terra page will be apprised of it very soon. There are a couple of titles that I'm considering, but I don't want to settle on one just yet.
Can you tell us about the novella a little bit more?
The novella, well, I wish I could. For those of you who know how Marque of Caine, who've already read Marque of Caine, Virtua is a real sort of crisis point for the Dornaani at this juncture. They've essentially they've become the Lotus Eaters. If you remember the way the series started with different code names that came out of the Odyssey, had they ever been categorized, they would have been the Lotus Eaters. And this is the reason. Their opiates are electronic. It is a seamless virtuality. And so Caine, in the process of trying to find the mother of his son, the woman who he thought he was going to marry, who was wounded in the second book and basically was only kept alive by the intercession of the Dornaani themselves. But they've misplaced her, if you can believe that, which is one of the first cues that this is Rome at the end. This is all the systems are still there, all the impedimenta and appurtenances are still around, but this is no longer the greatness of Rome. This is something that's operating in many ways on sustained inertia. And so he has to go and try to find her. One of the things he has to do is to go into Virtua, because there's some suggestion that they may have used Virtua to actually keep her more neurologically active for this extended period of time, this body in a sort of twilight state. And the novella takes place at a split point in the manuscript where he has to make a decision about whether to stay in Virtua or leave Virtua. So we know what happens to the Caine that left Virtua, but we don't know what happened to the other and how that may bear upon the series later on. So that's as much as I can really tell you without giving anything away.
Okay, fair enough. There are a lot of spoilers throughout the entire series. It's difficult to discuss the whole Riordan series, the Caine verse, whatever you want to call it, without giving too much away.
It's true.
but there's the background stuff. And last time I interviewed you, which we're not going to have this time, obviously, we talked a lot about your personal background, but we didn't talk a great deal about the science and how hard science fiction has not been on most people's minds. People have been of late marketing more of great epic fantasy and that kind of world building. And one person, Carol, asked a question that
Carol Geisander. Hi, Carol.
and she asks, I love that we got an ecology reproduction lesson. Did you do a lot of biology research?
I wouldn't say research, although I have no degree in science per se. Science has interested me for a long time, and it's the same sort of work I do. When if you were to ask me a question, for instance, about, well, what are the propulsion systems on the spacecraft? How do they manage not to be fried by radiation? How do they colonize other planets that probably don't have any cellular organisms, or even smaller, that are really like us, and it's not a totally toxic environment? I always did the research for those things, but it was easy in a sense because they always interested me. I kind of always knew I was heading in the direction of this series. So over the years, probably from my early 20s and even before that, I always had my finger on a lot of different pulses of a lot of different, if you will, our arterial conduits of the science of what we know about life, of what other kinds of life there might be. And one of the other things I wanted to do with this, and which if people think about the third book in the series, certainly gets into this, Raising Caine, is the number of science fiction series that I see that seem to represent reproduction as a 2, maybe 3-party event, or something like that, and even if they do, then they don't say, well, are the roles the same? The way that evolution drove certain human roles doesn't necessarily mean that it would drive the same kind of roles. And here, what you're seeing, and this is the first time Caine is really sort of is apprised of it, is that amongst the Dornaani, the bearers, which are not really females any more than the breeders or rather the quickeners are male, but they're the larger ones, and they tend to be the more aggressive. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this was sort of play this game of saying, well, if we're really going to look at aliens, let's throw as many preconceived notions as we can and stand them on their head. So that's a lot of what was driving this.
Okay, now I'd like to get a little bit into the process, because one of the things that you do and occurs more in, dare I call it, military science fiction, or what I think of as the Gordon R. Dixon kind, you collaborate in many ways with many people. You have anthologies with other people, including my partner, Barbara Krasnoff, has written short stories into your universe, but you also collaborate a lot with Eric Flint and other people. So how is your writing process different when you're writing by yourself versus those kinds of collaborations, or when you're acting as an editor as you are in Murphy's Law List?
So that would be an entire one of these interviews all on its own, but I'll try to stay right. I'll give the bullet point answers, the info bites. The first way that it's different is that when I sit down and I write in somebody else's universe, it's their sandbox. And that means that although I may do as much research, for instance, if you were going to look at a forthcoming novel in Eric Flint's Ring of Fire, which is called No Peace Beyond the Line, for anybody who is a fan of that series, this is the long-awaited sequel to Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. The amount of research I do on the islands, the amount of research I do on the weapons and metallurgy of the time and stuff like that is very, very consistent and of a piece with what I do for my own hard science fiction. But how much of that I put in, how central it becomes, all of that is determined by what I would consider the theme, the vibe of the series. One of the things that's different about 1632 is 1632 has a lot more humor in it. And I don't mean, thigh slapping humor or stuff like that, but there are a lot of characters who are, I don't want to say they're played for laughs, but they can alternate. There's a sort of serio-comic way that exists, particularly between married couples. Eric likes that. And you know what? So I see that, so I will use that, and I will go with that.
So the question is the process itself. Are you sending him chapters?
No.
Are
no,
people
no, no.
sending you things? Can you edit them? What's the actual process?
So my process with Eric, as a matter of fact, with all my collaborators to date, has been I write the whole thing and I send it to them. I don't know why that's how it worked out, but I guess everybody sort of said, from Steve White to David Weber, when I did something for the Honor Harrington University, almost 50% of the word count of Man Cause in War 13, I think, are two braided novellas of mine. And people just, so Larry, all those people, they just said, go do, they showed me a great deal of confidence. I run with it. I feel very comfortable doing that. I feel that there's a kind of, in the same way when an artist approaches a canvas or a musician is working with leitmotifs in music, I think there's a kind of a guiding vision. And I think that there's a lot that you get in a collaborative process, but at the same time, there's something you also get out of a guiding vision. And I feel, if somebody's going to give me that sort of ball to run with it, that's what I tend to do. So that's one of the big differences. When I guess you could say when I'm an editor, I very much try to do the same thing. I really do not. I'm not into line editing. I think that you don't get the best work out of writers, and I don't think they enjoy it as much. And I don't think that no one is growing, not the editor in a sense, and not the writer. The editor grows best when they are not prescribing, but they are encouraging. They're working more like, if you will, a docent and a shepherd, and say, but you do it. It's your thing, and it should belong to you. They should be your words. And that's something that I'm a very writerly editor, I guess you might say. At least I feel myself to be so. And that's very much how I try to do. Most of the places where I get involved are canon, because the science, as to go back to the original question, is really fairly there's a lot of detail in the universe, and sometimes you can get into a place where I need to step in and say, yeah, but that might not be exactly how that happened. So that's my overly long answer to your question.
Okay, and since you're going to be doing one more reading, we want to get to a couple more questions.
Yeah.
But this ties into what you were talking about. What do you have the most fun in writing when you're doing hard science fiction, and what do you have the most fun in writing space opera? Obviously it gives you fun. You are enjoying yourself. I can tell that when I read it, even when some of the stories are a little more dour than others.
Yeah, I think with space opera, I would have to say fun is not one of the first words that comes to mind. But what I do like there is I get a chance to I'm liberated from the constraints I set myself to keep the science fiction hard. And that gives me a sort of more of what I call a Heinleinian freedom, because he would take some pretty big leaps. So would not Verne so much, but H.G. Wells. And that is something that I have not done in my own, although as the series goes forward, when we get to technologies like Virtua and et cetera, I am taking bigger leaps, but I use building blocks to get there. Space opera allows you to go straight there. You know what I mean? It's like a big jump to a place where you say, you know what? I don't need all the science for this. I just need to make it plausible enough, and let's see what it does. One of the things that I enjoy in both areas, though, is that all technology has the law of unintended consequences. All advancement, all social progression tends to have the law of unintended consequences, which I don't necessarily mean is always negative. Just things happen. It's consistency. Whether I'm writing something that's fantasy, whether I'm writing space opera, whether I'm writing hard science fiction, it should be consistent unto itself, and there should be a rigor in that constancy. And that's where some of the most fun comes out as I'm looking at something that I've put into play, and I say, that would impact this and that and the other thing, and new stuff happens. That's a mixture of writing and just sort of creative discovery, world building sort of stuff conflated into one moment.
Right. Now, I have a parenthetical question because I don't want to run over it much or at all. How long is the next reading going to take?
The next reading is literally 4 minutes.
Okay, so that means we need to start it in, about 2 minutes.
Okay.
So, but this is a question that is paramount. I'm going to embellish it a little. The original part of the question is, how many books will there be in the Caine Riordan series, in the Caineverse? But my question is also, and did you have an idea of how far you were going to take that universe when you began writing Fire on Fire?
When I began writing Fire with Fire, I knew what this book was going to be about, Marque of Caine. I knew I was going here. And one of the reasons, in a space opera book, you could jump straight there. But this is what I meant about building blocks. I wanted I wanted readers to see and sort of experience along with Caine. When the book starts, when the first book starts, humanity has not gone to the stars and has no idea that it has company in the universe. And as I've said in other places, a lot of science fiction breaks into near future and far future. Far future tends to be more like space opera, and obviously why. So many reasons, I'm not going to get into that. Near future is constantly, it's very immediate, but it also tends to date itself. What I wanted to do, there's a bridge. There's got to be a bridge between those two places, between the near shore and that far shore. And when I sat down, I said, I want to write the story of setting foot on that bridge and crossing the bridge. And I knew, for instance, therefore, when I started that I was doing with Fire 5th, and I knew out to book 12, and to answer the question, how many, as long as you keep buying, I am happy to keep writing more and more.
As long as people are supporting independent bookstores like Mysterious Galaxy when they...
There you go. There you go. Absolutely.
I have to say that. Now, if your reading is 4 minutes, we have one more question, and I think it's a great question to wrap up with. So why don't you start that reading now? I will ask the question, and then we will all take our bows. Okay.
So at any rate, this is from At the End of the World. It is a solo novel, but it is set in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising universe. The basic setting is that a bunch of teenagers on a cruise to Discovery are at sea when the plague hits. They are going to one of the least probably desirable destinations that this place goes to, South Georgia Island, which was mostly a whaling station at the edge of subantarctic circle, and they are a mixture of spoiled kids and inner city kids with tough hard luck stories, and it is written in first person, which is a new thing for me. Not new, but it's the first time I've really felt it was the right thing, and it is done in epistolary journal style. So July 20. I didn't know I'd have trouble writing this entry, but when I finally got to my bunk and picked up my pen, my hand started shaking. This is the third try. I hope I can get it all down. The day started normally enough. The captain was up first as always, and he went to the place that was now his full-time station, the radio. With the exception of a short trip down to the condensers, he kept tuning through the dial again and again. And every time he caught a scratchy snippet of some signal, he'd drop the volume, as if the others didn't know what he meant, that he didn't want the rest of us to hear it. But apparently, while the captain was down checking on the condensers and I was busy giving a hand with the sheets, Blake slipped into the radio room. It was in the compartment at the bottom of the pilot house's companionway. Then, when the great ghoul of the ocean sea came thumping up the companionway, he realized he couldn't get out in time, so Blake ducked into the bridge locker, which was mostly empty except for signal flags, spare ropes, buoys, and other odds and ends. The first sign that something had gone wrong was Blake's long scream. "What? No, that's bullshit. That's totally bull." And then a thump and a long silence. I was the only one who didn't come running. Not like I missed a lot by walking, though. Blake was still sprawled on the floor, staring up at the captain in shock. You bastard, he whispered. You've been hiding it from us all this time. Chloe was frowning. Hiding what? Before Blake could answer, the captain stepped between them. That's enough. This is not a bloody democracy. He turned toward Blake. Mr. Lawley, you disobeyed my express orders about the radio. You will be disciplined when I am done. Even Chloe looked worried. Done with what? Done explaining what's been going on back home and how it bears upon our voyage. Blake made a sound that was partly a bark of laughter and partly a sob of panic. Yeah, it bears all right. The captain's eyes were on Blake. One more outburst, I'll confine you to your cabin. The pilot house was dead quiet. The captain leaned upon the pilot's console. A little over 3 weeks ago, coastal radio stations started reporting the outbreak of some new strain of flu. It started in the U.S., Los Angeles, in fact, but shortly afterward began breaking out elsewhere. About 25% of all infections are eventually fatal. Quite a few more never recover. Jesus, Rodney breathed. Spread through the developed nations first. They have better luck in containing it. When it hit less developed nations, such as those Central America, South America, it ran wild. He paused, looked around the group. No known vaccine, and it's racing ahead of conventional quarantine and isolation efforts. Suddenly, all I could think of, see, or hear was memories of my mom. Rodney had raised his hand. At any other time, it would have just added to his image as a doofus and a loser, but suddenly it seemed appropriate. The way we like to envision ourselves as adults had just gone out the window. There was only one real adult aboard. He had the dope on what was going on in the world, and without him, each and every one of us were as screwed as a nymphomaniac mink. These were the simple facts, and right then, the only ones that mattered. The captain nodded at Rodney's raised hand. Captain, you said that the virus is 25% fatal, but that even more don't recover. What happens to them? The captain frowned. Can't tell you exactly because the radio transmissions become so frequent and bizarre. Seems more than half those who survive suffer permanent brain damage that reduces them to mindless savagery, including cannibalism. If the pilot house had been quiet before, it was tomb-like now. Because at that moment, death seemed to close in all around us. I found myself making note of all the other kids on the trip in a way I never had before, as if they might be the last people on Earth. We sat there for at least half a minute, staring at the deck. I'm going to skip so I can get right to the end. The captain had never touched any of us for any reason until the moment that Blake tried to give him more lip. He grabbed him by the arm and pulled him off the deck. Leave off, he snapped. This isn't bloody TV fantasy. This is real. This is no Walking Dead of yours. You kill the infected, they stay dead. And the rest can't roam around forever. We can ride this out, and we won't be the only ones. There's no end of ships that might have. Captain, said Willem. Damn it, what? Alice is gone. When no one was looking, she had just gone to the side and climbed over. Using the engine for the first time in weeks, it took less than 3 minutes to get to her. Even so, she was damn near frozen by the time we did.
Wow, great. Now we're into what I hate to call, given John Ringo book, sudden death, but our time is more or less up. I have a quick announcement and then a last question. The quick announcement is that people can buy these books, particularly, well, any of these books, from Mysterious Galaxy. Like I say, you gotta support the stores that have been shut down by the pandemic and support your independent bookstores anyway. And if you buy this book, there'll be a link along with this video, and you can get a personalized signed book plate along with it. So Chuck will be virtually autographing these for you.
They've already been signed, so they can't be personal.
Oh, okay. But, hey,
but I did sign them.
But there you go. So the last question is, what other projects are you working on?
So as soon as I am done with this, I am going to be, tomorrow I get up and I finish the edit on the last of the 6 novellas in the Murphy's Law system, which will be bundled into a braided novel, to which I will add about 30,000 words, which will be coming out, I believe, sometime in September or October. Then after that, as soon as I'm done with that, I turn right around to actually turning in final copy. Probably be about 2 weeks of review, revise, and polish on At the End of the Journey, the second novel, the one that follows the one you just heard from. After that, I do the first 2 novels back to back in the Vortex of Worlds, which I've been looking forward to do for a long time. And all I can say is, it's not your daddy's fantasy, and it's not your brother's fantasy. It's not even your fantasy. This is Slipstream, and hold on, come along for the ride, but hold on.
Okay, well, that's wonderful stuff. I love it. I want to just sign off by saying I'm Jim Freund. With us has been Charles E. Gannon, and we turn things back over to Mysterious Galaxy.
And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Hello, everybody. I just want to second what Chuck and Jim just said. Thank you so much for everyone who participated and for all of your questions. And Jim, thank you so much for all the love to indie stores. If you guys would like to purchase Chuck's new book and get those signed book plates, we've got the link. It's attached to this video that zooming, you'll see it right at the top. But that is it for us tonight. Thank you to everyone so much for joining us, and have a good evening, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.